So we'll dive into the papers, and I feel like there was a lot of cool stuff this week in those papers and a lot of interesting things to explore. So let's do that. I'm going to turn this one off. Actually, maybe I'll turn that one on. This one off. Okay, distant students, you'll be back with us in just a second. All right. I want to start off just with a statistic that freaked me out when I read my first. There's a paper by Thomas that talks about extinction rates, and their projection was that by 2050, 37% of all species are committed to extinction. So that's a pretty heavy load to take. And this projection was based on these kind of bioclimactic niche models. And so part of what our papers that we read, the first two papers today that we read on predictions of biodiversity loss, were really all talking about how do you get this number? How do we know what this is? So I read this paper when I was doing my master's, probably in like 2006 or 2007, and it was incredibly startling to me because at that time I could do the math and see what age I would be and think about 15 to 37% of all species committed to extinction was just very, very scary. It's a scary statistic. So I want to talk a little bit about what these papers said about why some of these modeling efforts that have been done either over or underestimate the actual extinction rate. So I always forget which one is which. It's this one. So what were they saying? What did that Dawson Beyond Predictions paper, does anyone remember what their argument was, why they were saying that these types of models that only look at this are not working?
Well, I feel like that was underestimated because there are species that are relying on those species.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a cascading approach that cascading.
Yep, so it could be underestimated, and so there were some arguments that it could be underestimated, and you're totally right because of what would you call that, Mitch? Dependence, species dependence.
Yeah.
Or interaction.
Or symbiotic relationships.
Yep. Symbiosis. So what were the arguments that it was overestimation? And this was primarily from the Dawson paper.
They don't look at extinction rate. They don't take into account other scenarios, like focusing on the massive whiteout as opposed to some would adapt or
Absolutely.
one species or another species would come up.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. So when we think about what is vulnerable, so vulnerability, and this is really important when you're talking about, either species or human communities, and this is used for both. But when you're talking about vulnerability, you're talking about both exposure. So exposure is how is that species influenced by climate change. So that's sort of how the species itself in its range is exposed. And so these bioclimactic models that came up with this prediction are really only looking at exposure because they're saying this is the bioclimactic regime or niche that this species needs. And then they model how it might change, and they're just saying anything where it changes then is lost. But what they're not taking into account is sensitivity, and just like Lisette was saying, adaptive capacity. so all three of these elements are really important. Exposure is just, is the species exposed to this issue? Sensitivity is, how sensitive is this species to it? And then adaptive capacity is actually, so vulnerability equals exposure plus sensitivity minus adaptive capacity. And this adaptive capacity is kind of, how is that species able to adapt, which is what Lisette was saying. And so, why is it an overestimation? Because it's only accounting for exposure. So I think in all these papers, I mean, hopefully one of the things that you guys got out of it is just that it's really complex being able to really accurately estimate what the biodiversity loss is. I mean, everyone knows that there will be some amount of biodiversity loss, but what exactly will that look like? So one of the things that the Dawson paper was talking about too is just that it can't only be modeling. So this was based completely on modeling. Does anyone remember the other sources of information that Dawson said were really important to take into account?
Paleo, climate.
Yeah. Yeah. So paleoecology, which sadly we would have heard about if we had gotten that to work. Paleoclimate. Anything else?
Observations and real-time observations.
Yes. So real-time observations. So that, sorry.
Physiological models.
Physiological models? Yeah.
Ecological.
Yeah. So there's a ton of different sources of data that can really inform our understanding of biodiversity and what will happen in the future. And the argument is really, we can't just use these niche models. We have to look at these other sources of information. And what I might do is pull up some of those articles because they've had some really great graphs in them. How did you leave reading those papers? Did they make you feel less secure about what we know, or did you feel like, oh, there's all these sources of data and we just need to sort of explore it more and come up with, you know, sort of better gauges? What were your
I think a lot of that data is kind of irrelevant to our current situation because we don't like animals changing where they are as people. So we're kind of keeping them where they are.
Yeah,
They don't have as much free movement as they used to.
yeah. Yeah, and so we're already influencing this a lot. And I think what you speak to too is that it isn't just about the science, it's also about our value system. And one thing that the Fellard paper brought up that I thought was a really interesting thing to consider is the idea of what do invasives mean and what does restoration mean? And I think that that concept of restoration came up some in the papers about assisted migration and assisted colonization. And it kind of blows everything on its head. I don't know, do any of you have like a background in dealing with invasive species or in doing restoration work? Have any of you come from? Okay, so a little bit. So when you're typically doing that work, what are the assumptions that you're working under?
There's like sort of, we learned about this in the courses about class, that there's sort of like a baseline, like what the ecosystem is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
Which in a way, a lot of that, or as far as I know, is kind of based on this sort of like idea of like what, or at least in an American context, you know, what the content looked like when Europeans came.
Yeah. So kind of like the historic
Yeah.
reference state. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're always trying to get it back to whatever it was at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other assumptions?
I've done some, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Catherine.
I've done some prairie restoration, and basically, after working on it for a little bit, like their optimism definitely took like a downward trend, and they wanted to do, like this. I don't remember the number of acres, but they ended up doing like 90 to 25% because it was like basically an impossible task. So I don't know about like assumptions, but like the practical actual ability to do it is like really zero.
Yeah. Yep. So restoration is really, so typically the way that we think about restoration today, like Laurel said, is we're looking at kind of some historical baseline. What Catherine's saying is that it's really difficult to do, challenging, which is probably because partially things are changing. And so if you're trying to get back to that historical baseline, it's very, very difficult to do that and keep that state where it is. What about your restoration work? What have you?
I just helped with a little bit of like riparian cleanup that had some invasive species on it, and they were just spot spraying,
Yeah.
and I was just
Okay.
pulling
So it's
things
just
out.
more like,
So I definitely wasn't doing
these are
any of the like
supposed to be
planning
here,
or anything.
these are not supposed to be here. You
Mhm.
spray the ones that aren't supposed to be here. So
Exactly.
there are species that should not be there.
They're not fish,
Okay,
where you
yeah.
just go in and kill a bunch of fish. That aren't supposed to be.
Yeah, and
Kind of
so,
one of the questions.
oh, go ahead, Go ahead, Gwen.
One of the questions that I continually have on our creek restoration is what kind of system are we creating that we know nothing about? Are we creating this novel ecosystem that isn't going to interact with all these influences from the mind base that I work with? And are we really doing good? I don't know. That's kind of an underlying question that I always ask. With that, because we're messing with groundwater tables and kind of changing this whole 100 acres, and we don't really know, are we just out there with a backhoe? Yeah, mostly, but are we, I guess, causing more harm than good?
Yeah, yeah. And who gets to define what good is? And so I put sort of the influence of values, because whenever you do a restoration project, you're kind of imposing your values on the system and then trying to structure it in a certain way. So, what do you think that most?
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I really agree, and I'm really enjoying the conversations thus far, and I'm not going to hit on the point you just stated. As far as like what Laura was saying about an historical baseline, I kind of agree with her in the sense that historical almost needs to be put in quotes, because like she said, it's like our definition of historical, like now is kind of what it was like when Europeans came and like kind of conquered and altered the landscape for like economic gain. But it's kind of like that touches what Gwen was saying, is like, what is this novel idea? Is this like our like romanticized version of like getting back to like rulers like trees, or like getting like, you know what I'm saying, like getting this idea of what we have that comes from the journals of like Lewis and Clark, like this their version of what they saw. And so that then touches on like kind of like what Gwen was saying about, are we just like out here with the backhoe? It's kind of like, I went to a farmers conference and they're just saying that like when it comes to invasives, those are like your best urban medicines, because they're able to thrive in the conditions where they are, like that. Like when you like when you look for herbs, if you look for those that are like abundant and that are there from that place, and like I was even reading this quote that's kind of like some of the cutest evils that we have are like growing all around us in plenty. They're like these weeds that we want to get rid of. And so it's kind of like taking a step back from like this institution that people are getting paid and their career is like built off of these restoration projects that probably don't need to happen in certain time, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like making a mistake and fixing a mistake and making a mistake and fixing a mistake. So it's like we're constantly fixing, so I think it's like, you know, like letting nature, like when do we let nature heal itself and like restore itself?
Yeah.
So that's my kind of view on it.
Yeah, and so, and this kind of, I think your comments, Lindsay, are really well taken because you're talking about the way that we basically romanticize what has come before, and then we set everything up in restoration to emulate that. But how does that contradict in some pretty significant ways with the pull method of colonization, of assisted colonization? Do you guys remember what that argument was?
I don't remember the exact argument for that particular author. But I mean, when we say we romanticize, that puts derogatory kind of connotation to actually trying to do work that is valuable and is not derogatory. It's, I mean, just because you're trying to restore something to more of an original condition, which, I mean, there is no like original condition, of course. I mean, we can't make dinosaurs reappear, but I mean, there is a certain amount. Well, some dinosaurs, they're on their way up.
The Irish.
But you know, I mean, ecosystems do reach equilibrium. You know, a certain kind of equilibrium, and they were there before. I mean, pretty much before Europeans arrived. I mean, there was some stuff, but the population was not that big, and you weren't having that huge of an impact on the system before the Europeans arrived.
Okay, we have Will and then Laura.
Go ahead.
Not to get into a
I hate
full-fledged
this romantic
conversation about invasives, but
Yeah.
I mean, I've been usually on the side of getting rid of them, but then I've seen this other paper that talked about, for example, tamarisk, like salt cedars, that in areas with dams, they found that it's actually better. There's been like a lot of like human influence there, and then there's been like huge infrastructure projects that tamarisk is actually better there than trying to restore something that would be better ecologically speaking. So it's kind of hard to know.
Do you remember why they said that?
I'd have to look it up again. It was a while back.
I did a lot of work with tamarisk removal in like Lake Mead area, Cottonwood Cove area, and that it was always such a big controversy. Like you're out there on your hands and knees with a chainsaw, you know, cutting back all this tamarisk and spraying it, and you're not even making a dent. You're there for like 25 days, something crazy.
It's a lot of work to get. And I know that some of the arguments with tamarisk have been about Southwest willow flycatcher, which is an endangered bird that so much of the willows have been replaced by tamarisk that now a lot of the Southwest willow flycatchers depend on the tamarisk. And so there's some arguments that it provides habitat, and so if we're going in and doing these big restoration treatments, how is that doing habitat? But Laurel, did you have something you wanted to hear?
So one example that I want to throw out there, and I guess like this kind of is a continuation of what Phil said. So, okay, so back in Illinois, there's a lot of activity with trying to restore and recreate tallgrass prairie landscapes, like at small and large scales. And the thing is that, I mean, realistically, you know, it's not going to look like how it looked like before, like, because, I mean, for one, you had massive herds of bison grazing on them, and also, like, the natives would sometimes, like, set fire to the prairie for various reasons. But that's not to say that trying to recreate a tallgrass prairie landscape is completely pointless.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's, you know, it's more biodiverse than sod, you know, attract birds and butterflies and all that kind of stuff, so.
Yeah, and so I feel like what you're getting at a little bit is it's not necessarily, it's more biodiverse and it has maybe different ecosystem processes, and so it's not just beneficial for the exact composition, but for what that can do for the ecosystem. So this kind of gets into that idea of the push-pull model of assisted colonization. Does anyone remember what that article was arguing about the pull model?
Professor Knapp,
Yeah.
I don't exactly remember that argument, but I did look to make a comment in reference to our discussion.
Yeah.
So what Will was saying about like romanticizing that view of history and it being derogatory. So generally, like derogatory is like critical and or disrespectful. And I don't think that that view is necessarily disrespectful to say it's romanticized, because I think a lot of times our view, because I'm saying this from a historical standpoint, our view of like, let's say like the Americas, for instance, with colonization, we have there's a lot of times view of America that was a low population and that they weren't making such an impact. But if you look at like islands and Sertimas before Columbus, there was like at least like 98 million people living in the Americas that were killed by disease and warfare. But those people were coexisting with their ecosystem in a natural way. So I just think that a lot of times people will say like, oh, you know, there weren't a lot of people living back then. It's like they had whole civilization. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it kind of goes with that whole progression of history that we're constantly making a progression, when in actuality, we might not be making a progression in society and or our ways of with nature, climate, and other various changes.
Mm-hmm.
I have something to add to that too, just quickly.
Yeah.
I think that another important thing to keep in mind is, like, even with all the technology and everything that we have today, I think it can still be hard to kind of quantify things. And if you're looking at a historical baseline, there's not a strong record of these plants were here and these plants weren't, and they're not 100% reliable. And then they're also, it is someone's viewpoint because it was recorded by someone. So even if it's not, just like what we were saying, they might have a different perspective about the people that were there, but they could also be seeing different, they might have had a different viewpoint of, you know, what the ecosystem looked like.
Yeah, yeah, and so there's these different interpretations based on sort of who's writing the history and how we define the history. But when it comes to thinking about what does restoration look like in the context of climate change, I think that there's some big questions there. And so I'd like to get into that full model, because I feel like what it offers is something absolutely transformative of what we think of restoration today. So if no one remembers, I can.
I remember
Yeah.
that I had a little bit of trouble understanding, because it seemed like it was the same thing, like the push and the pull.
Okay.
But so push is where you identify like a species that's vulnerable to climate change, and so you take it, you put it somewhere else so it'll thrive.
Yeah.
And pull is where you identify the habitat and then you pull in different species that'll work there.
Yeah, and so you pull, but the idea of the pull is that you're actually using that species to restore, which I think is the like really kind of crazy thing that turns this whole thing on its head. So we traditionally have thought of restoration as there's a baseline, we want to get back to it. There is value in this, and I'm not trying to argue that there's no value in this. There is value in this, and the good thing about this is that it's providing ecological processes that are very important to maintain. But what the pull model is arguing is that in order to restore, let's say a habitat has lost a species that has a very important niche function. We're going to take a species from another area that does that niche function and bring it to this area to restore the area, which, you know, from a push perspective, you're just trying to save the species. So you're just trying to move it to where you think it might work. The pull model actually says that there might be some role for a non-native species in a new environment. And that's pretty, does that kind of clarify it for you, or?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's kind of this, you're doing the same thing, but with different objectives.
yeah, and kind of a different framing.
Yeah.
Like, instead of saying it's just for the species, and I feel like the poll makes you think about the entire ecosystem function more.
Right.
So instead of just saying, we really like Joshua trees and we want Joshua trees to be able to exist in the future, and so we're gonna move them, it's more like, what role does the Joshua tree play and how can we move it into a new environment? Yeah, James.
Yeah, just a way that I try to differentiate them is when I thought about pool, I looked at it as more like maintaining ecological processes.
Yeah, an ecological function, yeah.
Yeah, and then the push is more trying to save the species.
Process.
So push is more about like saving the species, and then the pull is more about saving like a system
Right.
that hopefully the species comes in and can fix.
Yeah, yeah, but that's a big, like, starting to get conservationists to think about ecosystem process and function instead of about individual species is a pretty hard, I mean, I've worked for a lot of conservation groups and I know that this transition is really, really tough and it rubs people the wrong way. It really makes people angry. Like, what, you're saying that we're not gonna save this species? You're saying that we're gonna let it go? I mean, I don't know how many of you have worked in environmental or conservation groups, but this is a pretty radical readjustment of the way that we think about how to conserve things.
Seems like completely logical though, but when you look at a species like rhino that you're trying to save, like how are you supposed to find its ecological system? Like its systems are gone, so you gotta figure out other ways to save it.
Exactly. And in those papers, I think that a big argument was, let's not just think about assisted colonization, let's think about habitat corridors and genetic diversity and all of these other things, because we can't just, we can't just focus on saving the species, and so we've gotta think about habitats and like how you make that happen. But, this kind of flies in the face, and then you think about, so we've thought about, how we've traditionally thought about restoration, and I mean, this connects with invasives. But think about if we were really doing assisted colonization on a large scale, what would that mean for the way we start to think about invasive species? Like,
Well, you're intentionally bringing invasives to unknown, not unknown, but completely different ecosystems.
yeah.
Invasives turns from something you're trying to get rid of to something you're trying to incorporate.
Yeah. Which is huge. I mean, that's then all of a sudden, like, who's to argue that, where do we draw the line anymore? Mitch?
We've done that a bunch already,
Yeah.
like biological controls,
Yeah.
nematodes, like the first thing that comes to mind, or transplanting non-native to restore ecosystem.
Yeah.
With mixed results.
I don't think they were thinking about the system as a whole though, like this whole idea. I think they were just trying to fix one problem at hand by introducing a biological control. Yeah, and so,
Yeah. Well, in a way, biological controls, one of the papers sort of made this comparison between integrated conservation actions and integrated pest management. And just when I think about biological controls, I think, that's like one piece in integrated pest management and how you manage for a species that's unwanted. And when you think about conservation, there's so many moving parts to all piece together, and then how do we know what the interactions will be? And I know that the adaptation group today is going to talk about phenology and sort of how phenology plays into all of this, but you just start thinking about all of the interweb of connections between species, and it's like, that last paper that we read, the Lunt, Neff and Larson, gave us those 4 different views of scientists and managers and like how we do this. And so I wanted to get a sense from you guys of when you are thinking about, you know, this push model and the pull and sort of how you sit in terms of your feelings about assisted migration, was there a group when you were reading that paper that you were like, yeah, I'm in that group? Or did you feel kind of just torn about where exactly you would land? Yeah. I
personally felt when I was reading that, I got kind of this sense that a lot of the environmental degradation and biodiversity loss that they were talking about was very related to our own lack of understanding of the overall health of ecological systems and the working of ecological systems. And so in my mind, when it comes to restoration work, I kind of just take a step back because I feel like I don't know enough about ecological systems or biodiversity or biological systems to actually have a hand in it or know what is best.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what got us into the issue in the first place.
Yeah.
So it makes me want to just take a step back.
Yeah, and say, which seems like it would be maybe the nativist technocrat of like, I'm going to refrain from taking action. I don't know enough about it.
But I want other people to take action.
Yeah, exactly. So the scientists out there to take action, not me.
Well, I think the systems are so incredibly complex. I don't think anyone could possibly understand the full potential of doing this. Like, I don't think we'll ever understand exactly what's going to happen. And I think that's why I want to step back, is because I think so many times in science, especially conservation science, we are quick to action and then end up realizing what we did had more negative impacts than positive impacts. And so, to me, I think it's too complex to interact, and the dangers of doing so are too great, or too high of a risk to make that decision.
Yeah, and so to stay out of it. I hear someone from a distance. Did someone want to add
Oh,
something?
that's me. I'm probably on the other end. Let's do it. And so I feel like if all the people with good intentions aren't the people doing it, who's gonna do it? So I think action is always better than inaction.
So you're probably the ecological interventionist?
Oh, but I waver. I also am a nativist technocrat because I'm also worried. But yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Any other perspectives, Casey?
I was going to say, wouldn't human intervention be best served like within our own species? I mean, if we could manipulate cultures and communities to stop these changes to begin with, then we wouldn't have to intervene in some ecological process that we know nothing about.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, I feel like, yeah, our energy could be put towards something more productive for us.
Intervening where we actually have control
Right,
over
where we
things, whereas
know
what
what's
Corbin
going on.
was saying is like,
Right.
how do we ever know what, you know, the influence of what we do in these larger systems is? It's a great point. It's a hard one.
And I think it's good that we've gotten to a point where we're no longer like trucking trout over the pass and throwing them in rivers, you know. But at the same time, there's things like zebra mussels, which right when they're born are like tiny, like 3 microns, you know, wide. And something like that, it wasn't brought over here on purpose, you know. So it's definitely tough.
Yeah. Did you have something, Tim?
I think if I was going to categorize myself, I would be a reluctant interventionist. And just reading the paper, it's they strongly believe that ecosystems will change and species will go extinct regardless of whether we enacted assisted colonization or not. And I think a lot of people would agree that that's probably a pretty accurate statement.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, oh, go ahead.
I said a lot,
I really
but
do.
not all.
I really agree with Casey with feeling like we should like focus on ourselves before we try to change something else. And I also just, cause I disagree with a lot of the terminology like assisted migration and assisted colonization. Like I feel like if we look historically, like the last time that we created like that type of colonization like wasn't good, not good to uproot things and move them where they don't belong. Like I think that we're still like trying to heal from that as a society. So it's not right to do that to plants and other things, and especially when you label things like invasive. That's like the same thing as labeling something as savage. And when you look at it like also the whole save the what if there's like a save the pterosaurs, like save the T-Rex, like you know, you can save dinosaurs, but some things might be meant to go extinct. And I'm not saying that there aren't things like accelerating that and those things shouldn't be that, but it's also like kind of logistics, like it's so complex that we don't know. Like I think we can change ourselves better that.
No idea what she said.
Good point. And it's interesting to me because do we feel like we can change human society at this point without changing the natural world? Can we do one and not the other? I mean, that's the place that I often get confused as like, is it possible to do that anymore? Like, can we, and why don't we? I mean, you know, why aren't we changing? Because I love the idea, Casey, but why aren't we doing that? And what are the barriers? And what is it about our impact on the natural world that we actually feel like it's more plausible? Because I really think that we do feel like it's more plausible for us to engineer the entire planet than to change our behavior.
Yeah, because there's not enough people who care about it. There's not enough people who care about these systems and who care about species dying off. So,
Whereas when you're changing the systems, you're changing something out of your, like where you're living, like our habitat. We're like fixing that habitat over there, but not ours. So we still get to do whatever we want, but we're fixing that.
Yeah.
And there's so much less resistance when you're changing things that don't have a voice compared to changing people who have very strong voices and opinions.
yeah, and you're changing the way they live.
Yeah. And so it makes us feel like we're doing something, but we're not getting at the root of the issue.
Especially, I think, when it's directed at like megafauna, like very charismatic megafauna. So like, you know, pandas and polar bears and rhinos and elephants, but no one cares about like the Southwest mealworm. You know.
Or soil organisms, which, you know, are the basis of all of our food webs. You know. Yeah. But if we can do something with something big, we feel good. Well. I'm sorry, I know that was a little bit disorganized, but I just kind of shot from the hip after not having the presentation.
Good job, Corey. Way to pull it together, Corey.